You probably didn't hear about it. That week, the headlines were full war escalations, another AI leap, a celebrity meltdown somewhere. But in a dusty West African town no one in New York or London was really paying attention to, something quietly happened. No breaking news, no hashtags, no press release. And yet, it might have changed everything. In July 2025, Burkina Faso signed a deal with Bangladesh. A trade deal, yes, but not the kind that gets buried in the economy section. This one didn't go through Washington, or Brussels, or any of the usual gatekeepers. It was direct, raw material for raw value, no middlemen, no permission slips. To be clear, this wasn't a revolution with flags or chants. It wasn't televised. It was tractors, cotton, and soil. For years, maybe decades, Africa's role in global trade has been, let's say, pre-written. Export cheap, import expensive, wait for loans, accept terms, smile for the photo op. But what if someone decided to throw that script out? What if a country one the world doesn't usually take seriously just went ahead and did things its own way? You might be wondering, okay, but why should I care? Maybe because this isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about the idea that a nation, any nation, can choose to stop waiting, stop asking, and start building. And maybe, just maybe, that idea travels further than cotton ever could. So let's slow down, rewind, and really look at what happened, because while most of the world scrolled on, a quiet kind of rebellion was starting to grow, and it didn't come from power. It came from the ground. To understand why this deal matters, you have to understand the game Africa's been forced to play. It's the same pattern. A country grows something, cotton, cocoa, cobalt, you name it. They sell it raw, dirt cheap. The price isn't set in Lagos or Ouagadougou. It's set in Paris, or London, or Chicago. By people who've never touched the soil, never seen the work. Then that same country buys it all back packaged, processed, branded for 10 times the price. You think that's trade? Number, that's dependency. Dressed up in spreadsheets, and it's not new. This goes way back: colonial trade routes dressed up in modern suits. Ports controlled from the outside. Loans with conditions so thick you'd need 3 lawyers and a miracle to navigate them. Agriculture turned into extraction. Farmers turned into laborers. Sovereignty reduced to paperwork. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, especially for the West. Because this deal between Burkina Faso and Bangladesh, it didn't follow the script. It didn't ask the IMF. It didn't involve the World Bank. There were no boardrooms in Brussels. No polite language about capacity building while pulling strings behind the scenes. It was, you need cotton. We grow cotton. Let's talk. That's it. And for a system built on layers of permission, oversight, consultants, frameworks, dialogues, and technical assistance, that kind of clarity, it's dangerous. Why? Because if it works, if 2 countries at the bottom of the global power chain can just look each other in the eye and say value for value, then what happens to the whole apparatus? What happens to the donors, the gatekeepers, the ones who've made a business out of helping? You starting to see the ripple? This wasn't just about cotton. It was a crack in the model. And the reason it's making people nervous quietly, behind closed doors, is because it wasn't loud. It was simple. And sometimes, simple is the most subversive thing you can do. Let's get specific. Take cotton. Burkina Faso is one of the top cotton producers in Africa, more than 800,000 metric tons annually. But here's the thing. Most of that cotton doesn't get spun or processed anywhere near Burkina Faso. It's shipped out usually through ports in West Africa, controlled by French or foreign interests, then routed through buyers in Europe or Asia. Prices are dictated by global indexes. Middlemen take their cut. Brokers get their margin. And the farmer? Maybe he gets paid in time. Maybe not. In 2023, Burkina Faso earned around $400 million from raw cotton exports. Sounds decent, right? But compare that to Bangladesh, who imported that same cotton, turned it into garments, and exported over $45 billion worth of textiles in the same year. That's not a typo. 45 billion. That's the loop. Africa grows the raw. The world turns it into gold. And what's worse? The infrastructure that allows this to happen, ports, roads, financing, pricing mechanisms, is rarely in African hands. It's built and controlled by development banks, donor-backed agencies, or multinational corporations. Even logistics routes are political. Try exporting cotton from Burkina Faso directly to a partner in South Asia without going through a Western shipping route or clearance house. Just try. You'll run into regulations, tariffs, outdated trade agreements, and if you're really unlucky, flat-out denial from a third-party broker in Europe who says, "We need to evaluate the quality first." Evaluate the quality of cotton grown for generations, from soil worked by hand, from farmers who can smell a good harvest before they even see it? No, what they're evaluating is control. And let's not kid ourselves. This doesn't just apply to cotton. Cocoa from Ghana, lithium from the Congo, coffee from Ethiopia, the pattern's the same. Export raw, import dependency. So when a country says, "We'll sign a deal directly with no permission from the usual gatekeepers," that's not just trade, that's threat. It threatens the idea that progress needs supervision. That sovereignty needs training wheels. That wealth has to trickle through a maze before it reaches the people who earned it. And maybe that's why this small, quiet agreement between Burkina Faso and Bangladesh matters more than anyone expected. Because the more you study the system, the clearer it becomes. It's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to. It happened without cameras, without a podium, no global summit. No G7 applause, just a table, 2 delegations, and a signature. July 2025, in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city, dust on the roads. Farmers watching from the edges. A bilateral trade agreement signed between Burkina Faso and Bangladesh, not in theory, not in principle, on paper, ink, final. It didn't need approval from Brussels. It wasn't part of a G20 framework, no nod from the IMF, and that's exactly what made it so dangerous. Because here's what the deal said: Burkina Faso will export raw cotton directly to Bangladesh. No third country rerouting, no clearance through Paris. No foreign brokers, no certification body based in Europe, just farm to factory. And it wasn't just cotton. The agreement also included joint training, agricultural exchanges, irrigation technology, pest control innovation capacity building. Yes, but on equal footing. This wasn't aid. This was partnership. Bangladesh, for its part, didn't hesitate. Why would they? They need the cotton. Their $45 billion garment industry depends on it. The math works. The politics even better. But what this deal really offered beneath the trade clauses and cooperation protocols was something harder to measure: narrative control. For once, an African country wasn't waiting for development, wasn't asking for integration, wasn't lobbying to be included in global supply chains. It was saying clearly, "We'll write our own terms." That changes everything, because systems of power rely on more than economics. They rely on ritual, on who gets invited to the room, on which corridors power is allowed to walk through. A small country bypassing all of that, signing a deal without consultants or Western observers, shatters the unspoken hierarchy. And don't think nobody noticed. Within weeks, quiet murmurs began to surface in regional policy circles. Memos titled "Unregulated South-South Partnerships" started circulating. Trade analysts began warning of trend acceleration risks in West Africa. The worry wasn't about cotton, it was about precedent. Because if Burkina Faso can do it, who's next? Mali, Niger, Ghana? What happens when countries realize they don't need to go through Paris to reach Dhaka? What happens when cooperation doesn't need translation? What happens when the global South stops acting like it's waiting for its turn and just moves? It didn't take long for the change to show. 3 months after the ink dried, tractors began arriving, dozens at first, then hundreds. Over 400 units, most of them domestically funded, some redirected from bloated military budgets, rolled out into rural provinces, not imported from Europe, not leased from foreign contractors. Bought, owned, operated by locals. It was the first time many of these communities had ever seen mechanized farming up close. In one northern province, an elder farmer simply said, "I never thought I'd see a machine touch this soil before I died." He wasn't exaggerating. For decades, farmers had relied on hand tools, donkeys, and luck. Rains came late, fertilizer came later. And when the harvest finally arrived, prices had already collapsed somewhere overseas. But now, something shifted. 68,000 tons of fertilizer were distributed on time. 710 motor pumps, 239 motorcycles, thousands of liters of pest control treatments, not as aid, as infrastructure. And when the rains did come, people were ready. Fields once half abandoned were brought back to life. In the center-west region, yields tripled within one season. Millet, maize, sesame, and for the first time in years tomatoes. Enough to fill warehouses, enough to build something more. In Bulsa, a small town rarely mentioned in any report, construction quietly began on a $12 million tomato processing facility, funded locally, staffed locally. Engineering by students from a public university. No overseas consultants, no glossy white papers, just concrete, steel, and people who decided to bet on themselves. And yes, it worked. Within 6 months, trucks were moving product, not to European ports, but to domestic markets. Tomatoes weren't rotting in the fields. They were being labeled, packed, sold, and profits? They stayed. But maybe the most telling shift wasn't financial, it was generational. Youth who once left their villages for city slums or tried to cross the Mediterranean were now staying, or coming back. The government launched a national youth mobilization program, training over 2,000 young people in modern agriculture, cooperative leadership, and business skills in just 3 months. Cooperatives sprouted fast. Land was made available freely for pilot projects. Local mentors stepped in, and suddenly, farming was no longer framed as failure. It became a path, a plan, a future. That's when observers started paying closer attention, not because they cared about tomatoes, but because they saw something harder to define: momentum. And in geopolitics, momentum is more dangerous than any manifesto. You can't build momentum in a vacuum. As the tractors rolled and the factories turned on their lights, whispers started turning into memos. Think tanks, policy briefings, closed-door meetings in Paris, Brussels, Washington. They weren't panicking, not yet, but the tone shifted from curiosity to concern. One internal EU trade memo, leaked in late 2025, labeled the Burkina-Bangladesh agreement as a potential inflection point in Francophone Africa. Another report from a US-based consultancy described it as a Sahel disruption signal. It sounds clinical. But between the lines there was unease. Why? Because something that was never supposed to happen did. And now, others were watching. In Mali, farmers' unions began calling the Burkina model the most dignified path forward. In Ghana, a motion was introduced in Parliament to explore bilateral partnerships with Southeast Asia, bypassing EU intermediaries altogether. In Niger, where foreign troops once patrolled roads that led nowhere, villages started organizing their own agricultural cooperatives, no donor involvement. And in India and Turkey, new diplomatic visits were suddenly scheduled, quiet trips to Ouagadougou, focused not on aid, but on collaboration, fertilizer technology, cold chain logistics, solar-powered irrigation. This wasn't just South-South cooperation, this was South-South realignment. For decades, trade diplomacy in Africa followed one playbook: donor talks, strategic aid packages, roundtable discussions hosted in European capitals. Africa was either in need or in waiting. Either way, the assumption was clear: it wasn't leading. But this time the model came from the inside. And it didn't require validation. So what did the West do? They watched, carefully. In Washington, USAID began reallocating small grant programs toward youth entrepreneurship in the Sahel, an effort perhaps to re-engage. In Brussels, a public statement praised Burkina's grassroots revitalization, but didn't mention the cotton deal once. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, funding timelines for West Africa were reviewed, accelerated, adjusted, but the most telling shift came not from government buildings but boardrooms. Multinational commodity traders began requesting new guarantees from African suppliers, fearing more direct deals could bypass them. Logistics firms with long-standing port contracts raised concerns about parallel channels. One shipping executive reportedly said, "If they start rerouting supply chains, we're not just losing cotton. We're losing leverage." And they were right, because what Burkina Faso planted wasn't just crops or factories, it planted an idea, one that other nations could water in their own soil. And ideas, once they spread, are hard to contain. Not everyone cheered. For every field revived, for every young person who returned to the land, There was someone somewhere wondering what they were losing, because systems don't collapse from outrage. They erode when people stop asking permission, and Burkina Faso had stopped asking. Inside institutions that once managed Africa's economic future, the silence grew louder. The World Bank didn't release a statement. The IMF didn't offer analysis. But in a quarterly West Africa report buried under pages of regional trends, one sentence stood out. An increasing number of Sahel nations appear to be pursuing non-institutional trade pathways with limited oversight. That wasn't a warning, that was a red flag. In global finance, limited oversight is code for we're not in control. And then came the consultants, development firms that once landed contracts to design agricultural programs were now offering unsolicited, technical reviews of the Burkina model. Academic papers popped up in European journals questioning the long-term viability of state-driven rural investment. Let's be clear, this wasn't analysis. This was friction, soft resistance, polite doubt. Because a successful model that doesn't rely on Western institutions, that creates a problem. It shifts leverage, it breaks rhythm, and most importantly, it redefines who gets to write the rules. Some internal briefings even framed Burkina's approach as populist, warning of increased regional instability if unsupervised agricultural experiments proliferate. Experiments? Tell that to the farmers watching their third harvest double, to the cooperative leaders balancing real books, to the young men who traded a smuggler's boat for a shovel. But of course, that's not the part that fits neatly into a donor report. Meanwhile, old political elites inside Burkina itself weren't exactly thrilled either. This model didn't require their foreign connections. It didn't flow through their usual networks. In fact, it threatened them because it worked without them, and power unused becomes irrelevant. There were murmurs, bureaucrats dragging their feet, delays in land approvals, training budgets, lost in transition. Nothing explicit, just slow, sticky resistance, the kind that tries to exhaust change, not confront it. But here's what they didn't expect. People had already seen what was possible. And once people see something work with their own hands, on their own land, it's hard to sell them helplessness again. That's what made this dangerous. Not the cotton, not the money, the belief. Because belief, once rooted, doesn't ask for permission. It just grows. Something changed. Not just in the fields, but in the way people started showing up. In village after village, farmers who used to skip community meetings were now filling town halls, not to demand aid, but to plan harvests, allocate equipment, request training schedules. It wasn't charity they were after, it was coordination. Because when the government delivers before the rains, not after the drought, people notice. When officials show up in boots, not suits, people talk. And when promises stop sounding like campaign speeches and start looking like diesel in the tank, pipes in the ground, or seeds in a child's hand, that's when trust stops being abstract. It becomes physical. In Burkina Faso, that trust started to show up everywhere. Mayors began holding open forums with farmers. District officers joined morning briefings with cooperative leaders. Even youth councils formed organically, students debating seed quality, land access, storage logistics, not because anyone told them to, but because they saw that their input mattered. And slowly, a line was being erased, the one between the people and the state. This wasn't idealism, it was feedback, response, cause and effect. For the first time in years, the government wasn't just making policy, it was co-creating results. That distinction matters. Because in much of the world, especially in post-colonial nations, governance has often been transactional. You vote, maybe. They govern, vaguely. And in between, silence, mistrust, distance. But now, something else was forming. A different kind of contract. Not legal, emotional. Built on the understanding that leadership doesn't mean commanding from above, it means delivering from below, not controlling the people, serving them. And when that happens, politics changes. In urban centers like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, conversations began shifting. Civil society organizations started focusing less on foreign aid accountability and more on domestic food systems. Agricultural justice, land ownership, distribution equity. Campaign slogans began to evolve from promises about global partnerships to commitments about local production. Suddenly, votes weren't about ideology. They were about irrigation, And when politics becomes that grounded, that granular, something rare happens. Legitimacy starts to grow, not from constitutions, from carrots. Because when people eat from a system they help shape, they defend it. Not because they're told to, but because it finally feels like theirs. And in a region long fractured by coups, insurgencies, and absentee leadership, that kind of belonging is more stabilizing than any military budget. By the end of the year, it no longer felt like a pilot program. It felt like a pattern. Inputs were arriving before seasons started. Roads were being repaired, not just main highways for exports, but feeder roads connecting farms to markets. Seed distribution was digitized. Cooperative bank accounts were being opened, real ones, not paper registries. And crop prices? Still volatile, yes. But now, farmers were in the room when pricing formulas were discussed. This wasn't perfect, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was visible. That visibility changed everything, because once a system becomes visible, it becomes copyable. Journalists started flying in not for press junkets but to walk fields. Delegations came quietly from neighboring countries. Not to offer advice, but to observe. In some cases, to ask, "How did you manage this without us?" One senior trade official from East Africa put it plainly, "We thought we needed 10 consultants and 5 donors to do this. Turns out, we might just need courage." And that's when the shift became symbolic. Burkina Faso had gone from being a case study to a precedent, not in theory but in practice, not in projections but in production. They didn't just show that an African nation could build a functioning trade system from the ground up, they showed that you could do it without asking permission first. And the symbolism didn't stop at cotton. Other sectors began watching. Health workers asked why supply chains for medicine couldn't be organized the same way. Educators questioned why vocational programs weren't tied to regional demand the way agri-cooperatives were. Even local tech startups began building inventory tools for village grain storage. This wasn't top-down transformation. It was lateral, sector to sector, province to province, proof to proof, because when something actually works, it doesn't need a billboard. It spreads through impact. And what gave the Burkina model power wasn't scale, it was clarity. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't revolutionary in the ideological sense, but it was complete. Production, distribution, value retention, local reinvestment, youth inclusion, institutional cooperation, not as talking points but as habits. And habits, once repeated, become systems. Systems, once trusted, become culture. And culture becomes identity. Burkina Faso didn't just rebuild its agriculture, it redefined its posture. No longer the beneficiary, not the beggar, not even the emerging economy. Just a country, acting like it belongs in the conversation, not because it shouted louder, but because it started with the land and built up. No official statements came from Washington. Brussels didn't issue a response. The IMF remained silent. But something shifted, not on paper, in posture, because what Burkina Faso did wasn't about isolation. It wasn't anti-global. It was post-permission. And for the first time in a long time, the conversation didn't revolve around what Africa needs. It revolved around what Africa chooses. In a global economy still dominated by legacy pipelines of influence, of debt, of assumed hierarchy, Burkina Faso stepped off the path, not to protest it, to ignore it, and to build something of its own, on its own terms. That alone is disruptive. Because when you no longer seek validation, you remove the leverage others have over you. And the quiet part, the part no one wants to say out loud, is that the system depends on people not realizing they can walk away, but now they know. And once that idea takes root in one country, one district, one community, it doesn't need a manifesto. It spreads the way crops do, slowly, seasonally, but inevitably. Some will call it unsustainable. Others will call it dangerous. Some might try to contain it, reframe it, co-opt it. But the truth is simpler. Burkina Faso didn't break the system. They just stopped waiting for it to fix them. And in doing so, they exposed something fragile underneath all the forecasts and frameworks. A fear that maybe, just maybe, the world isn't as dependent on the old powers as the old powers would like to think. So the question isn't whether this model will survive. The question is, what happens now that the door has been opened? Will others step through, or will they be talked back into waiting rooms? That's the part no one can predict. But one thing is clear: the soil is no longer silent. And if you're listening closely, you'll hear it too.